start with a fresh slate and help the families who need it most. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Michigan.
I yield myself 30 seconds.
Gentleman is recognized for 30 seconds.
25% of the people of Texas go to sleep every night without insurance. 25%. And people come here defending the status quo. As of December 2011, 357,000 young adults in Texas gained insurance coverage. Since it was enacted, Texans with Medicare have saved a total of over $220 million on prescription drugs, and over 2 million people with Medicare in Texas have received free preventive services. That's progress in contrast to the status quo, 25% uninsured. I reserve.
Gentleman reserves his time. Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Camp.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to a distinguished member of the Ways and Means Committee, the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Smith.
Gentleman from Nebraska is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of the bill today to repeal the health care law. In speaking with employers in the 3rd District of Nebraska, it's been very interesting to hear their perspective. Certainly when they tell me that they are holding off on hiring because they simply do not know how much a new employee will cost due to these government mandates. In fact, they're paying overtime to very willing employees because the employees currently are so concerned about the economy, they're certainly eager to work that overtime so they can achieve some financial security. So we've got an imbalance here in the employment sector, and we need to fix that. I'm also concerned that the very bureaucratic approach, for example, with the small business tax credit, when I hear from an accountant that tells me it takes longer to calculate the tax credit than it does for the remainder of the small business's tax return. We can do better. We owe the American people better, and certainly we need to repeal this bill, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Does the gentleman continue to reserve?
I do.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Camp.
At this time, I yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Louisiana, Dr. Fleming.
Gentleman from Louisiana is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the chairman, and thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, by any reasonable measure, America has the best health care system in the world. Certainly the many world leaders who come here for treatment are a testament to that very fact. However, over recent decades, a slow but steady government takeover of health care by growing entitlements has crowded out the private marketplace, creating an inefficient system whose costs are now completely out of control. As a family physician who was elected to Congress in 2008, I came here to bring consumer choices, transparency, and efficiency back into our health care system, putting health care decisions back into the exam room where they belong. Instead, Democrats passed Obamacare without even one Republican vote. It essentially doubles down on the cost inefficiencies and lack of accessibility to good health care that already existed, and puts Washington fully in control of your health care decisions that will ultimately lead to yet another large, unaffordable entitlement system. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. As the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin, continue.
If you would tell the two of us from Michigan how much time there is on each side.
Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin, has 7 minutes remaining. The gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Camp, has 9½ minutes remaining.
So why don't I reserve one more time, Mr. Camp, Mr. Chairman, and then I'll go forward.
Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin, reserves. Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Camp, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Huizenga.
Gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 1 minute.
I appreciate my fellow friend from Michigan yielding this time. And I'm a freshman. This is my first term in session here in Congress. And I wasn't here for the passage of this bill, but I can tell you I am here because the American people wanted change. They did not and will not accept what was passed by this previous Congress. And you're going to hear a lot today about how it has helped people. We cannot go back to the status quo. But this is not the solution. This is not the way, and that's why I rise today in strong support of the repeal of the Obamacare Act, H.R. 6079. The fact is, the recent Chamber of Commerce survey indicated that a whopping 74% of small businesses say that the law makes it more difficult for them to hire new employees. I'm one of those small business owners who's been paralyzed trying to figure out what my insurance costs are going to be for my employees. In addition, the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office predicts Obamacare will reduce the nation's labor supply by 800,000 people, not something that we need right now. Not only is this law full of compliance uncertainties and disincentives for growth.
15 seconds.
Gentleman is recognized for 15
The Supreme Court recently made it clear that the individual mandate is, despite what the President and my colleagues in this body are trying to say, it is a colossal tax increase on the middle class. While I'm disappointed in the decision, we know that the American people want us to come back in and change this law because it will not help them in the long run. Thank you very much.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin.
I now yield 2 minutes to another distinguished member of our committee, Mr. Kind, from the great state of Wisconsin.
Gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I thank my good friend from Michigan for yielding me this time for his leadership on this issue. Mr. Speaker, just to address the previous speaker's comments, if you're a small business in America with 50 or fewer employees, you don't have to do a goddamn thing under the Affordable Care Act other than receive tax credits for offering health care coverage to your employees. So let's stop this nonsense of trying to scare small businesses throughout America. It's been pointed out on the floor by numerous colleagues this is the 31st attempt in this session of Congress to repeal all or part of the Affordable Care Act. Even the Washington Post pointed out earlier this week that Baskin-Robbins only offers 30 flavors of ice cream. Enough is enough. And when I first heard that the United States Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act, my first feelings was relief and happiness. Not for me or anyone else who was involved in advancing the cause of health care reform, which was desperately needed. It is a system that has failed too many Americans for too long. But it was happiness for a one-year-old little boy who I had a chance of meeting back home in western Wisconsin by the name of Henry. See, Henry's mother informed me that before he was even born, he suffered a seizure in her womb. And therefore, the very first breath he took in his life, they were informed that he was uninsurable because he had a pre-existing condition. And that family was depleting their entire life savings, making sure that Henry was getting the health care treatment that he needed to survive in his life. We're better than that as a nation, folks. And the Affordable Care Act, as this family pointed out, changed that immediately for Henry and that family and for 39,000 other children throughout western Wisconsin who have a pre-existing condition. 45,000 young adults in Wisconsin now can stay on their parents' plans because of this act. Seniors in Medicare get a 50% price discount for the prescription drugs that they need in their life. You want to talk about a big tax increase? Take away the 35% tax credit that small businesses are getting today for providing health care coverage, which goes up to 50% in 2014. Or the $800 billion in tax credits that individuals and families will receive under the exchange so they can afford health care coverage.
I yield an additional 30 seconds.
Gentleman is recognized for an additional 30 seconds.
Let's talk a little bit about that tax increase that people are going to be facing if they're successful in repealing this legislation. What we need is for more cooperation and more effort in reforming a health care system that is complicated. It is too expensive. And we have tools in place now in this legislation that will not only enable reforming the way health care is delivered, so it's more integrated, coordinated, patient-centered, but how we pay for it. So it's based on the value or quality of care that's given and no longer the volume of services that are rendered, oftentimes with poor results. I encourage my colleagues to vote no on this, and let's work together to improve a health care system that's in desperate need of improvement. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Camp.
Thank you. At this time, I yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Quayle.
Gentleman from Arizona is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, 2 weeks ago, the Supreme Court voted to uphold Obamacare. This decision confirms that the repeal of Obamacare must take place in the very body in which it began. This decision reminds us that there is no greater calling, no higher honor than the defense of our constituents from the tyranny of government overreach. We have seen what socialized medicine and endless entitlements has done to Europe. Well, let me be very clear. Obamacare is no more than a Trojan horse inserted at the global epicenter of freedom. It's bad for our doctors, it's bad for our patients, it's bad for our economy, it's toxic to our middle class. From its insidious taxes to its strangling regulation to the oppressive mandate that lies at its core, Obamacare is bad for America. This bill gives us all a chance to vote, to defend the values upon which our great nation was founded. I urge my colleagues to support this bill and repeal Obamacare. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Michigan, Mr.
I
Levin.
reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Camp.
At this time, I yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Nunnally.
Gentleman from Mississippi is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the chairman for yielding. You know, everything they told us when they passed this law has turned out not to be true. If you like your own health plan, you can keep it. This isn't a tax hike. Prices will go down $2,500 a year. It won't affect religious freedom. The list goes on. Now, I was disappointed in the Supreme Court ruling, but I did note the Supreme Court said it was not their job to say whether this is a good or a bad law. Well, the American people can answer that question. Obamacare is bad for health care. Obamacare is bad for seniors. Obamacare is bad for hardworking Americans. Obamacare is bad for job creators. And Obamacare is bad for freedom, and that's why it must be repealed.
Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin, does he continue to reserve?
I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Camp.
At this time, I yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Lamborn.
Gentleman from Colorado is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to support freedom and prosperity. Obamacare, call it a tax or a mandate, is a threat to personal liberty. My constituents in Colorado want to work directly with their doctors for their health care without going through a federal bureaucrat. Obamacare burdens small businesses and families by imposing more than $800 billion in new taxes that will make it impossible for them to grow and thrive. The Independent Congressional Budget Office estimates that employers will create 800,000 fewer jobs by 2021 as a result of Obamacare. In fact, we're already seeing how this is hurting jobs today. The National Retail Federation found that 48% of business owners cite the potential cost of health care as a reason why they are not hiring additional workers. We can fix what is wrong with health care through patient-centered reforms that are targeted and affordable. But first, we must protect our freedoms and the economy by repealing Obamacare.
Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin.
I reserve.
Reserves. Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Camp.
At this time, Mr. Speaker, I yield 1.5 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Pence.
Gentleman from Indiana is recognized for 1.5 minutes. Without objection. Gentleman from Indiana is recognized.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. I rise today in strong support of the repeal of Obamacare Act, which will fully and immediately repeal the Affordable Care Act. Obamacare is not merely a government takeover of health care, but as many of us insisted during debates on this floor 2 years ago, Obamacare is a massive tax increase on everyday Americans, small business owners, and it must be repealed. Every day in Indiana, I hear people tell me that Obamacare is stifling our recovery. If it's not repealed in full, Hoosiers will face higher health care costs and increased taxes. The medical device tax alone could cost Indiana more than 2,000 jobs. But the issue before us today is not just about economic growth. It's about freedom. Obamacare erodes the freedom of every American, opening the door for the federal government to legislate, regulate, and mandate nearly every aspect of our daily lives under the guise of its taxing power. Left unchanged, Obamacare will change this country forever. But I truly believe in my heart this law will not stand. For in the end, the fate of our freedoms rests not in the hands of a president, a Congress, or a court. For we are and have always been, and shall ever remain, a government of the people, and by the people, and for the people. And while this Congress this week will vote to repeal this bill, I believe the American people will have their say on a day this fall,
and some Congress someday will repeal this legislation and build us a health care system that will focus on lowering the cost of health insurance without growing the size of government. I yield back.
Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin.
Could I ask my colleague, how many speakers do you have left?
I believe 3 or 4.
3 or 4? I'll reserve one more time.
Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin, reserves. Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Camp.
How much time is remaining?
Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Camp, has 3 3/4 minutes remaining. The gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin, has 4 1/2 minutes remaining.
This time I yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Florida, Mr. Sutherland.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized for 1 minute.
I'd like to thank the gentleman from Michigan for yielding the time. Today I rise in support of H.R. 6079 to repeal the President's health care law. H.R. 6079 will end the individual mandate, the tax hikes on the small businesses, of which my family has been proud owners of for many, many generations, the devastating cuts to Medicare, and the government intrusion into America's private health care decisions. While I'm disappointed with the Supreme Court and the decision that they made by not striking down the President's health care bill, I'm disappointed. I remain committed to its full repeal. Under the health care law, over 1 million Americans will be at risk of losing their own current health care plan. The average American family will see a $1,200 increase in their health care premiums. Many of those families I know in our family community are going to be devastatingly impacted. As I have said time and time again, bad procedure leads to bad policy. And 2 years ago, my goodness, on full display, we saw bad procedure. And that's why I stand here ready to cast my 10th vote in favor of repealing the President's health care law. And with that, I yield back my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin.
I now yield 2 minutes to the very distinguished member of our committee, Mr. Crowley from New York.
Gentleman from New York is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank my friend from Michigan for yielding this time. I listened to my friend from Indiana a moment ago quote President Lincoln. I would like to think that if President Lincoln were president today, he would have supported this legislation, the Affordable Care Act, and maybe we would call this Lincoln Care today. Well, I would say myself that I would call it President Lincoln Care, as I call it today President Obamacare. I notice my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, they're very much on target in terms of the talking points today. Each and every one has repeatedly called it Obamacare, a pejorative, bringing down not only the legislation we're talking about, but diminishing the office of the President of the United States. And I remind, we have many people listening to the debate today, including young people. We should be holding the office of the presidency. That's why I call it President Obamacare. But this morning, the Speaker of the House, when asked why we are wasting time and energy on yet another repeal vote, said, and I quote, "We are resolved to get rid of a law that will ruin the best health care delivery system the world has ever seen." Resolved to get rid of the best health care system the world has ever seen? That was what we had before the Affordable Care Act? I think my constituents, and I would dare say some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, would disagree with that. Would we want to go back to a time when insurance companies could deny coverage for arbitrary reasons that put bottom lines ahead of patients' needs? Back to a time when families worried about how they were going to afford coverage and lived with the fear that a single medical emergency could send them into bankruptcy? Back to a time when seniors were overwhelmed by prescription drug costs with no relief in sight? No. Americans don't want to go back to that time. In fact, when we passed the Affordable Care Act, President Obama and Democrats in Congress were resolved. We were resolved to actually improve our health care system. We knew that the status quo was not working for far too many Americans. So we were resolved to ensure everyone had access to affordable health care coverage. We were resolved to guarantee that that coverage would work better.
I yield an additional 30 seconds.
Gentleman is recognized for an additional 30 seconds.
We were resolved to guarantee that that coverage would work better for patients and for families. I'm not sure why my colleagues on the other side of the aisle don't share our resolve to make life for our constituents better today than it was prior to the passage of the Affordable Care Act. And I don't understand the resolve to preserve what was an inadequate status quo by voting tomorrow to take a giant step backwards. My colleagues, our friends on the other side have no vision. And that's why we're here today, talking about going back to the future. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Camp.
At this time, I yield 30 seconds to the distinguished member from Colorado, Mr. Tipton.
Gentleman from Colorado is recognized for 30 seconds.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, the common ground that we have is seeking affordability and accessibility. Obamacare fails on both counts. We've heard comments from our colleagues saying more is yet to come. That's exactly what the American people, workers, senior citizens, American families are worried about. More to come. We cannot find doctors. We're seeing our costs increase. We hear the comments that are coming. It is the Affordable Care Act. The problem is there's nothing affordable about it. It is a $2 trillion tax increase on the back of struggling Americans. This is something, if we're going to stand up for true health care, we need to make sure that we repeal this bill, repeal it now, and replace it with common sense.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin.
I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Michigan.
At this time, I yield 30 seconds to the distinguished gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Gosar.
Gentleman from Arizona is recognized for 30 seconds.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of the Resolution 6079. The court said Congress can impose new taxes and the individual mandate is constitutional as a tax. And as Dr. Seuss would rhyme, if it walks like a tax, talks like a tax, and quacks like a tax, the Supreme Court will tell us surely it is a tax. And so it did. Maybe we can serve it with green eggs and ham. Uncle Sam, I still don't think Americans will like this Obamacare sham. Uncle Sam, loyal to patient-centered choice I am. And as the ledgers on exploding costs are already showing us, and the courts declared that day, a tax burden is what Obamacare, and Americans remain dismayed. I yield back my time.
Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin.
Are you ready to close?
Yes.
I yield myself the balance of my time.
Gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
As I stand here, I think I want to remember others from the state of Michigan who years and years ago argued this issue. I think I'll go back to John Dingo's father, who was from Michigan, a member of this distinguished body, who started with others this effort to bring health insurance to every person in this country. After 7 decades of failure, this now happened, and the Republicans want to repeal it without anything to replace it. So I'll quote again Governor Romney, Mitt Romney, and he said, "A conservative approach is one that relies on individual responsibility. But in my view, and others are free to disagree, expecting people who can afford to buy insurance to do so is consistent with personal responsibility, and that's a cornerstone of conservatism. It's really a cornerstone also of America as a community, and to repeal this is to undermine the sense and reality of community in the United States of America. Remembering the past and looking to the future, we must vote no to repeal." I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Camp.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself the balance of my time.
Gentleman is recognized for 1 3/4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This law is overwhelmingly unpopular. And the reason is it's because it's fundamentally flawed. And the flaw is that government is being placed at the center of health care decisions that should be made by doctors, families, together, not by the government. Look at the other measures that we can use to examine this law. The price tag of the law has already doubled. It's over $1.8 trillion now. Health care premiums are going up. They're not going down as a result of this law. They're going in the other direction. And Americans are losing the insurance they have and like. And there's a perverse incentive in this bill for employers to drop coverage because it's cheaper for them to pay the tax in the bill. Also, taxes are being raised in general over $500 billion in this legislation. And 12 of the 21 new taxes in this law hit the middle class. It'll make costs expensive for more than 90% of the seniors. And it's paid for with budget gimmicks that even the government actuaries say aren't going to work. The Congressional Budget Office has said this law makes job creation harder. If we could only have, what we need really is to have a stronger economy that will help create jobs, but this law makes it harder, according to the CBO. We can't afford that after 41 months of unemployment above 8%. This law is bad for workers, bad for families, bad for patients, doctors, and employers, and I urge that we repeal this law, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time.
I'm glad you were riveted. I'll be watching for about 1 minute.
So who's going to manage? Todd's got it. They're keeping track of it. Wow. Where do you want to?
Gentleman from Minnesota is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I understand we're moving into Phase 3, and the time will now be divided between myself and the ranking member, the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Andrews. Is that correct?
Gentleman is correct.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in strong support of H.R. 6079, the repeal of Obamacare Act, and yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On June 28th, the U.S. Supreme Court dealt a devastating blow to the American people. In a sharply divided opinion, the Court upheld the President's decision to tax individuals who don't purchase government-approved health insurance. If Washington can dictate that private citizens must buy health insurance and impose higher taxes when they fail to do so, it is difficult to conceive of any limit on federal power. While I disagree with the Court's ruling, that is not the focus of our debate today. We are here instead to overturn a flawed and failed law. The government takeover of health care is destroying jobs. It is raising health care costs. It is the wrong prescription for an ailing economy. It must be repealed. We promised the American people no less, and we owe it to them to keep our promise. The need for repeal has grown more urgent in light of Friday's disappointing jobs report, which marked the 41st consecutive month of unemployment greater than 8%. A close examination of the health care law explains how it's contributing to the jobs crisis facing this nation. Hundreds of additional boards and bureaucracies, thousands of pages of complex regulations, billions of dollars in tax hikes, and trillions of dollars in new government spending. These are the burdens the health care law has piled on the backs of working families and job creators. For more than 2 years, the law has crippled our economy and undermined employers' ability to grow their businesses and hire new workers. This is not just my opinion. We see evidence from job creators across the country. Gail Johnson, an employer from Virginia, said the law will, quote, ultimately slow or stall the growth of small and mid-sized businesses as we struggle with the costly new requirements. Speaking of the law's draconian tax on medical devices, Dennis Johnson, Vice President of a medical device manufacturing facility in Indiana, said it will, quote, undoubtedly force us to cut critical R&D funding and inhibit job creation and retention. And Will Connect, president of a family-owned manufacturing company in Pennsylvania, testified that, quote, the sheer monstrous size of the law intimidates most Americans and provides so many unknowns for the business community, it is scary. Without any doubt, Mr. Speaker, Americans are concerned about getting this economy moving and putting people back to work. As these and other employers have accurately described, one of the greatest obstacles standing in the way of economic growth and prosperity is the President's health care law. Through his government takeover of health care, the President has created a destructive roadblock to lowering health care costs and private sector job creation, and he has disrupted the careful balance of power between the people and their government. Whether at congressional hearings and public forums or at the ballot box, the American people have spoken. They want their elected leaders to repeal Obamacare so we can pave the way to private sector job growth and lower health care costs. I urge my colleagues to stop defending a broken law and start standing by the American people. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on H.R. 6079, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves his time. Gentleman from New Jersey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to begin by yielding myself 15 seconds.
Gentleman is recognized.
Our side's going to try to bring some facts to the debate. My friend from Minnesota, chairman of the committee, said this is a job-destroying health care bill. Since the day the President signed the bill, American companies have created 4.3 million private sector jobs. At this time, I would like to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Texas who clearly understands the need for high-quality health care for all people in our country, Mr. Hinojosa, for 2 minutes.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong opposition to this legislation that would take away health insurance for over 30 million Americans, force seniors to pay more for their prescription drugs, and add billions to our deficit. In my great state of Texas, we have the highest uninsured rate in the country, a disgraceful 25%. One of those uninsured was a little boy named Houston Tracy from Crowley, Texas. Houston was born with a heart defect just days before the passage of the Affordable Care Act and was deemed uninsurable from birth for a pre-existing condition. His case drew national attention, and eventually his private insurance company backed down under pressure. Today, under the Affordable Care Act, no child will suffer the indignity baby Houston met. Insurers can't deny children coverage over a medical need. These are the protections that Republicans want to take away from us today. Just yesterday, a Republican member of Congress said that if she had her way, she would rather spend every day voting to repeal the Affordable Care Act. So, rather than working to pass legislation to put Americans back to work or stop the outsourcing and offshoring of American jobs, Republicans would rather spend every day doing nothing but scoring political points by voting to take away health insurance for the millions of Americans while offering no solution for people like little Houston Tracy and the thousands of other children like him who would be left at the mercy of the insurance companies. This is a cruel bill. I urge my colleagues to vote no on the Republican bill. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman from Minnesota.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I am very, very pleased to yield 2 minutes to the chairman of the Workforce Protection Subcommittee, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Walberg.
Gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the chairman. And Mr. Speaker, my friends across the aisle decry the fact that we've now voted over 30 times to defund, dismantle, and repeal the law. But, Mr. Speaker, isn't it right to challenge a tool of destruction of the American health care system, the economy, and personal freedom of choice? In Michigan, the law has stifled economic growth and hiring and raised health care costs for everyone. It would impose 21 new or higher taxes, 12 of which directly affect the middle class, workers, and families. It would lead to a gross tax increase of almost $570 billion over 10 years. It will cost $1.8 trillion over the next 10 years, nearly double the original estimate. Meanwhile, the Obama administration has failed to decide what government-approved health insurance will look like, leaving employers uncertain about what the future expenses and taxes they will face. White Castle, in a hearing just prior to this, has indicated they've held back on creating 400-plus new jobs because of this uncertainty. As if the cost of jobs in the economy wasn't enough of a negative, Obamacare also cuts $500 billion from Medicare to finance new entitlement programs. It reduces Medicare care itself. According to the American Medical Association, 1 in 3 primary care doctors already limit the number of new Medicare patients they take due to the cost. Once the law is fully enacted, CMS estimates that about 15% of Medicare Part A providers will become unprofitable and drop out entirely, leaving seniors with fewer options. Additionally, the President's hand-picked 15-member independent payment advisory board is even more troubling. Its purpose is to control future Medicare spending, so that if Medicare grows beyond what is sustainable, the board has the power to recommend cuts and ration care. Rights of conscience violations are mandated in this bill. This must stop. I recommend all my colleagues support the repeal of this bill and going back to a patient-centered approach that offers this health care system a sustainable ability and care for our citizens.
Gentleman's time is expired. Gentleman from New Jersey.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself 30 seconds. I'd ask my friend from Michigan if he could just stay for a question. My friend from Michigan just said that there's an estimate that the bill has doubled in cost, and I've read all the CBO analyses of this bill. I wonder if the gentleman could tell me the source of his statement from the Congressional Budget Office that the bill has doubled in cost from the original estimate. I'd be happy to yield to him.
Well, I appreciate you yielding. It is the CBO. Go to the Congressional Budget Office. They have directly stated that.
Reclaiming my time, if the gentleman could supplement the record with the date and the document that says that, I would appreciate it. At this time, I'm pleased to yield to a gentleman who's become an expert on the budget who understands that this repeal bill increases the national deficit and debt. The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Scott, for 2 minutes.
Gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, 2 years ago we passed Obamacare, and now the Supreme Court has ruled that it is in fact constitutional, and even after this ruling, some are ignoring the fact that these reforms are working. We know that there are children with pre-existing conditions who now have insurance. We know that there are young adults who have had car accidents, and their families did not have to go bankrupt for health care costs because they were able to stay on their parents' policies. We know that there are seniors who are receiving assistance when they fall in the donut hole. We know many people have discovered curable diseases when those diseases were in fact curable because they didn't have to save up for copays and deductibles for their annual checkups. We know that there are people with serious illnesses who no longer fear being kicked off their insurance plans in the middle of treatment when they need the coverage most. And in 18 months, all Americans will be able to afford a comprehensive health care policy. All of this was done in a fiscally responsible way, and why would anyone want to take away these protections and leave people without health security? Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to oppose this 31st attempt to turn the clock back on the advancements made under the Affordable Care Act. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Minnesota.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to yield now 3 minutes to the chairman of the Subcommittee on Health, Employment, Labor, and Pensions, the distinguished gentleman from Tennessee, Dr. Rowe. 3 minutes.
Gentleman from Tennessee is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Speaker. I rise today to urge my colleagues to vote for repeal of the Affordable Care Act. As a physician, I've taken care of families for more than 30 years. And during my time on the front lines, I watched our health care costs skyrocket and our health care freedom erode. I observed 3 major problems with the health care system. 1, it cost too much. It's unaffordable for many people. 2, there were people who didn't have access to care and affordable health insurance. And 3, there's a liability crisis in this country. The problem is too much government. So more government's not the solution. Unfortunately, the President and his party did not learn the lessons of Tennessee. At Tennessee, it began a universal coverage in the 90s called TennCare. And in 10 short budget years, Mr. Speaker, I saw our costs triple from $2.5 billion a year to $8.5 billion a year, and I saw access for patients go down and the quality of their care go down. The Affordable Care Act applies this same failed idea to the whole country through a 2,700-page bill and more than 13,000 pages of rules, and still writing. The Affordable Care Act doesn't address the major problem, which is cost, and it's also going to cost jobs. I spoke to a business owner in Tennessee just this afternoon who has 800 employees. He said his HR people look at this plan, he's going to have to lay off 50 people, put 150 people on part-time work, and possibly close some of his stores. We need to create an economic environment that creates jobs. The last Congress passed legislation that would destroy jobs. And make no mistake, our health care system was fundamentally flawed before the Affordable Care Act was signed into law. But the Affordable Care Act made a bad situation, I believe, worse. The fact is, we don't have a free market medical care today. About half of all the health care bills are paid by government. But that aside, with all the court cases, the policy proposals, the statistics, it's still important to remember that health care is about human beings. It's about people. There are no Republican or Democrat heart attacks. I've never seen one. I've never operated on Republican or Democrat cancer in my life. So we need to talk about solutions in a bipartisan way for everyone. Health care is too important to be left to insurance bean counters and to Washington bureaucrats. Government always makes things more expensive and eventually leads to shortages, to long waits, and to rationing. Let's just talk about a few ideas of what we should do next. Let's start by just leveling the playing field and give all individuals the same tax break that businesses get right now. Just treat an individual like a business. Let's start by empowering our seniors and saving Medicare by giving them choice. Let's allow small businesses to join together to compete for more affordable insurance, just like big corporations do. And let's let...
Yield at 15 more seconds.
Gentlemen, it's 15 more seconds.
Let's lower prescription costs by allowing folks to buy medicines anywhere in the world that's safe, and let's reform medical malpractice. And finally, let's force insurance companies to compete for your business across state lines. Health care freedom is about the right incentives, personal empowerment, not government mandates and regulation. I strongly encourage a yes vote for this bill, and I yield back.
Gentleman from New Jersey.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself 30 seconds.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, we know what our Republican friends mean when they say give seniors more choice under Medicare. They mean let them choose which insurance company, which private insurance company should run Medicare instead of regular Medicare. American seniors know you can count on the Medicare guarantee no matter what the circumstances are, whether you're profitable to take care of or not. That's why they support Medicare. That's why we support Medicare, even though the majority has voted on several occasions to terminate the Medicare guarantee. At this time, Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to a gentleman who understands that pre-existing conditions should be made illegal and insurance companies should not be able to pursue them. The gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Tierney, for 2 minutes.
Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank the gentleman. You know, it was interesting. We just had a hearing in one of the committees here in Congress, and we had 4 witnesses who were speculating about the fear and the myths and all the things that they hypothesized could be terrible if the Affordable Care Act were to go into effect. And then we had one witness who was the worst nightmare for those people, who was a Massachusetts business person with 1,000 employees, president of the largest chamber of commerce in the country, was the member of the board of directors of one of the larger banks, and was in fact the regional consultant to the Fed in that area, who said that since Massachusetts accepted the equivalent of Affordable Care Act, not only his business has done better, and his employers have done better, and his profits have gone up, but in Massachusetts the economy has done better. More people have been working, less people have been using the emergency room, and more employers are covering their employees. And in fact, that's what it is. The facts certainly outweigh all the speculation and the myth and the fear-mongering that we see going on. You know, there are millions of people who are already taking advantage of the Affordable Care Act. One of those is in my district, Terry Pallery, whose son is a firefighter who's working towards his paramedic certificate, who has to spend hundreds of hours in an internship that's not paid for. He's 23 years old. He wouldn't have health insurance under his father's plan if this bill the Republicans proposed were to go through, and some 3 million other young Americans wouldn't be covered on health insurance plans as well. This is misguided legislation that would end that kind of a benefit. It would also mean the end of a meaningful consumer protection like the 80-20 provision, where we force insurance companies to actually do something they hadn't been doing, covering health care, providing health care services instead of paying bonuses and executive salaries that are through the roof, advertising and other costs, anything but health care on that. It's estimated that some 12.8 million Americans are going to receive more than $1.1 billion in rebates because of that provision alone. It would also see, if this bill to repeal passed, small businesses, failure to get from 360,000 small businesses would no longer get the business tax credits, and they would no longer be able to cover some 2 million employees. Now, this list goes on and on. We can show you example after example of people who would fall into the donut hole as seniors for coverage that are now being protected by the Affordable Care Act. Let's find out what we can do about jobs. Let's stop this 31st, whatever it is, attempt to repeal an act that's not going to be repealed, and get the American people back to work.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Minnesota.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to a distinguished member of the committee, the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Petri.
Gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized for 1 minute.
Today I rise to support the repeal of President Obama's health care law. I support health care reform that ensures that all Americans have access to affordable health care. However, I believe the health care law is fundamentally flawed in its approach and will only make worse our skyrocketing high health care costs and federal deficit. A study last month found the cost of health care services is expected to rise 7.5% in 2013. I'm also very concerned about the law's negative effects on job creation. Met with hundreds of employers in my district and hear constantly how the mandates and uncertainties created by the law are discouraging hiring. A report issued by the investment research firm UBS last September said that the health care law was, and I quote, arguably the biggest impediment to hiring. We need the right reforms to eliminate waste throughout the system and reward high-quality, low-cost care. We should be choosing approaches which give consumers incentives to use their health care dollars wisely. Instead, we're going in the opposite direction by turning decisions over to the government. I support this bill and would urge all of my colleagues to work together to implement real reform to ensure every American has access to affordable health care.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from New Jersey.
Speaker, I yield myself 20 seconds.
Gentleman is recognized.
We share the gentleman from Wisconsin's concern about squeezing down health care costs, and the record shows that since the Affordable Care Act was enacted, growth in Medicare costs, which had been 8% annually, has fallen to 6% annually by stopping giveaway corporate welfare profits to insurance companies and other waste while increasing Medicare benefits. I'm now pleased to yield to a member who understands that being a woman should never mean paying higher premiums or being a pre-existing condition. The gentlelady from California, Ms. Woolsey, I yield 2 minutes.
Gentlelady from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
Well, our ranking member today has proven something that's very clear to me. This is baloney. The arguments are baloney. So baloney, baloney, baloney. We're here, Mr. Speaker, standing on the House floor for the 31st time with the majority serving more baloney regarding the Affordable Care Act. They haven't brought a single jobs bill to the floor, but for the 31st time in the last year and a half, they're voting to repeal the Affordable Care Act. This is just another political show. Act 31 in the Republican theater of absurd. In a moment when what we need is real leadership to tackle serious challenges, I'm still waiting for the majority's constructive ideas on health care, but all I hear are crickets. This leads me to conclude that they truly prefer a health care system in crisis. Millions uninsured, out-of-control costs crushing families and small businesses. They must believe that it's okay for insurance companies to deny you coverage because of a pre-existing condition, and particularly to charge you more if you are a woman. They're obviously against seniors saving on prescription drug costs, and they're against increased access to preventive care. We need to strengthen these reforms instead of dismantling them. The Affordable Care Act is the beginning, not the end. Actually, for nearly a half-century, Medicare has proved to be coverage for seniors and those with disabilities to be fair, cost-efficient. So maybe, just maybe, it's time to give every American those same benefits. We could do that by passing Medicare E, Medicare for everyone. Enough baloney, because it's time for the wealthiest nation in the world to provide health care for all. I yield back.
Gentleman from Minnesota.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm tempted to get in the lunch meat debate, but I'll pass for now. I'm very pleased to yield 2 minutes to a very distinguished member of the committee, the gentlelady from Illinois, Mrs. Biggert.
Gentlelady from Illinois is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the chairman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to voice my strong support for H.R. 6079 to repeal the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. Whether it's dropped coverage, higher costs, or lost jobs, the unintended consequences of this legislation continue to add up. And now that the Supreme Court has declared the individual mandate to be a tax, we know that this law contains over 20 distinct tax increases. We cannot continue to ignore the impact of this law on jobs while millions of Americans remain out of work. Nor should we cut $500 billion from Medicare or leave in place new rules that the CBO estimates will eliminate employer-sponsored insurance for millions of Americans. Instead of tinkering with broken pieces, we should take the cleaner route, repeal the law, and end policies that are raising costs. In their place, we can enact consensus-driven, bipartisan solutions that Democrat leaders have ignored in the past. At the same time, there's no reason we can't maintain coverage for pre-existing conditions and young adults. Let's give the Americans what they want: lower costs, access to quality care, and more choice. We can do that through the associated health plans for small businesses by allowing consumers to buy insurance across state lines and by extending health savings accounts. And we must move forward on common-sense legislation to curb junk lawsuits that drive up costs and force doctors to practice expensive defensive medicine. Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to join me in repealing this regrettable law. Then we can put our focus back on effective reforms that will deliver lower costs without putting the government between patients and their doctors. And I yield back.
Gentleman from New Jersey.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself 30 seconds.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, we continue to hear this charge that there's $500 billion in Medicare cuts in the health care bill. Here's the facts. The new law, rather, eliminates a corporate welfare subsidy for certain health insurance companies and goes after some wasteful Medicare practices. All the Republican speakers who've spoken today must agree with those cuts, because every single one of them have voted for every single one of those cuts in the last 2 Ryan Republican budgets. Every dollar of Medicare savings in the Health Savings Act is in the last 2 Republican budgets. I'm pleased at this time to yield to someone who understands the benefit of families being able to keep their sons and daughters on health insurance policies until they're 26. My friend and colleague from New Jersey, Mr. Holt, for 2 minutes.
Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the gentleman from New Jersey who is so expert in these matters. Matt from West Windsor wrote me, "I graduated from college this past May and am currently working at a job with no health insurance. I have a pre-existing condition, and shockingly, I truly would be without insurance and in big trouble if this legislation is reversed." Carolyn from East Brunswick contacted me to say she'd been laid off and her COBRA benefits were about to expire. At age 25, and because of the Affordable Care Act, she can enroll as a dependent on her father's federal employee benefits plan. Mary from Princeton wrote, "Our son has cystic fibrosis, and he would be subject to both the lifetime cap on benefits and the denial because of pre-existing condition, were it not for the provisions of health reform." Many people in New Jersey tell me they need those things that the health reform law does for them, including protections against premium increases, as well as many others, like coverage for young adults, ensuring that people with pre-existing conditions have access to health insurance, and the elimination of lifetime limits. Now, the majority here who are trying to repeal this law say they want to keep those provisions. I say get real. You cannot repeal the law and still have the provisions of the law in effect. I yield back.
Gentleman from Minnesota.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd now like to yield 2 minutes to a member of the committee, the distinguished gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Wilson.
Gentleman from South Carolina is recognized for 2 minutes.
I would like to thank Chairman Klein for yielding. I am thankful for his leadership on this very important issue, promoting limited government and expanded freedom. Due to the passage of Obamacare, America is set to experience the largest tax increase in our nation's history, which destroys jobs. Over the past year and a half, House Republicans have voted over 30 times to repeal, defund, or dismantle the President's job-destroying health care takeover. If this law remains on the books, 21 new or increased taxes will be imposed on the American people and small business owners. Already, the 2,700-page bill has generated over 13,000 pages of mind-boggling regulations destroying jobs. Over the 4th of July recess, I visited Columbus, Ohio, and read a very thoughtful editorial in the Columbus Dispatch entitled Placebo. The article states, quote, "The law creates headaches for businesses of all sizes that are likely to create a continuing drag on the economy and job creation. Small businesses employing close to 50 people will resist adding more workers, since 50 is the threshold at which the law requires them to provide health care or pay a penalty or tax," end of quote. Throughout the last 3 years, the President and the liberal-controlled Senate have pushed government red tape, stalling economic growth, just like the policies of Obamacare. Our unemployment rate has remained at over 8% for 41 months. It is clear the President and his liberal policies are destroying jobs. In order to put Americans back to work, we must start by repealing this overreaching bill and then vote for the process of replacement by market reforms as developed by Chairman Tom Price of the Policy Committee. I yield back my time.
Gentleman from New Jersey.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself 25 seconds.
Gentleman is recognized.
The gentleman just said this is the largest tax increase in American history. Here's the record. There are two kinds of people who will pay higher taxes under this law. 97% of American families won't pay one dime of tax increases under this law. The first family that pays a tax increase is a family with a gross income in excess of about $300,000 a year. It's about 1%, maybe 2% of the U.S. households. The second is a person who can't afford health insurance, who elects not to buy it, who uses the emergency room and expects his or her neighbors to pay their bill. That's not the largest tax increase in American history. At this time, I'm pleased to yield to a gentlelady who understands who gets hurt if this law gets repealed. The gentlelady from San Diego, Ms. Davis, for 2 minutes.
Gentlelady from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Here we are debating for the 31st time to repeal health care reform. But again, repeal would be a tragedy for America. Repeal would mean that children with pre-existing conditions would lose their health care coverage. Repeal would mean that 86 million Americans will no longer have access to free preventative care services. Repeal would mean seniors would no longer save money on their prescription drugs. Repeal would mean that 16 million middle-class Americans would not get tax credits to pay for their health care. Repeal would mean that my constituent sister who had breast cancer would still lose her house due to excessive medical bills because she cannot afford health insurance. Repeal would mean that my constituent who had successful ovarian cancer treatment years ago would still not be able to purchase health insurance because of her pre-existing condition. There are millions of Americans who are fortunate enough to have health insurance they actually like. And they ask me, why should they support reform? Well, first, this economic downturn should have taught us all that we are just one pink slip away from losing our health insurance. By allowing the unemployed to purchase affordable insurance, health care reform changes that. Second, the uninsured who have no other choice but to use the emergency room as a primary care office drastically raise hospital rates for the rest of Americans who do have insurance. And as a result, the insured are paying substantially higher premiums, and a mere trip to the hospital to rule out an appendicitis costs $5,000. By requiring that everyone who can afford it have insurance, health care reform changes that. Small business owners in my district concerned about the new mandates and health care reform asked me why they should support it. These small business owners have always wanted to offer their employees health coverage, but they haven't been able to do so because the cost has been high and unpredictable. Health care reform changes that. Now, small businesses have a risk pool for more stable and affordable premiums. What repeal really means, Mr. Speaker, is that affordable health care now within reach for so many Americans would become a distant dream. I yield back.
Sorry. Chairman from Minnesota is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, can I inquire as to the time remaining on each side?
Gentleman